Okay, so welcome to the 21st episode of An Evolving Man. Very delighted to be speaking to one of my heroes, Nick Duffell, today. Nick is a psychotherapist and trainer in private practice who pioneered therapeutic work with ex-boarders and specialist training for psychotherapists. He is the author of The Making of Them, Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege, and Wounded Leaders. So welcome, Nick. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much. Well, being a psychotherapist, I have to tell you, if I'm anyone's hero, I'm bound to let them down. That's the sort of thing we take for granted. So anyway, thank you for that nice introduction. Yeah.
Well, I've got a guest at the moment, and I was just telling the story of how I first came across your work. And she says, "Oh, you've got to tell him this story."
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, go on then. So I was living in a Buddhist monastery in 2002. I had started to awaken that I'd realized I had issues around boarding school. I'd come across a couple of books by some of the old boys, Coleridge from my school and Bede Griffith. And I was starting to see a psychotherapist. And she said to me one day, she says, "You have to read this book called The Making of Them by Nick Duffell." And I'm like, "Oh, I've never heard of it. I don't even know if I made a note, but some part of my brain, it went in." I got back to the monastery that day, and in front of my door was this book, and I kind of looked at it and I was like, "Oh, kind of like this." So I turned it towards me and I was like, "The Making of Them, Nick Duffell." And someone had left it in front of my door that day. They didn't know that my therapist had spoken about it. And he'd finished reading it. He'd also been to boarding school. He'd been to Ampleforth.
Okay.
And exactly that day, and there it was. I'm like, oh
yeah, that's incredible, isn't it? How these things happen. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Yeah. Well, I wrote that book in the end of the 90s, or most of the 90s. It took me about 10 years to write that book.
Wow.
And it took me a while to get it I was trying to get it published, and I had various offers of publishing it, but I had to break down and take out the personal material. It was very difficult for publishers because the book encompasses sort of educational stuff, psychological stuff, sociological stuff, political stuff, and personal stuff. And I was told that actually they wouldn't have any idea what shelf to put it on. And in the end, I had a professor who had a student writing a thesis on boarding who knew about my work so far, and she wanted something to publish. So she said, "I can publish it, through an obscure press called Whir, which did psychoanalytic stuff, but you'd have to break it into two. Otherwise, just do it yourself." So I did it. And it's still selling today, and it still speaks to people, which I'm terribly pleased about. And I get letters, every week from people who've just written it, and it's still sort of completely under our control. And that cover that you flashed, that the cover was done by a guy who, it was a man who used to be in Mungo Jerry, Steve Jones, and he'd done a few album cover designs, so he designed that.
Really?
Yeah. And
I thought that was you see.
No, you see, I would, people think that, but I would never expose my child like that. It's much too precious, I think. And so we took the picture of a well-known boarding school, I shan't mention which it is, and rearranged it with Photoshop, early Photoshop, and then sent the thing off to the printers, and it came back. Actually, it was a colored thing, and it came back black and white, and it was a big mistake. But when we thought, hey, maybe this is meant to be quite a gray experience for many boarders. So it stayed gray, and it's been gray all the time. So that's why it's kind of gray, in case you're wondering.
And it's just a brilliant book. I remember reading through it. I even remember where I was sat in one of the rooms in the monastery, and it was like, oh my God, that's me. Oh my God. Yeah, that double bind and so many aspects. I just, yeah, if people haven't read it, then please do pick a copy up.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I guess the first question I have, which I didn't put down, but I like to ask people is, you know, what drew you into doing this work? What was your boarding school like on one level, and what drew you into moving
Right.
into
Well,
this?
well, you know, there's one answer, a logical answer. There's another answer, which is a sort of irrational answer, is that, you know, we never kind of know what our destiny is, do we? I mean, it sort of gets forced upon you in a way. And the thing was, how it started was I've just gone into psychotherapy training. I'd gone into psychotherapy training because I had a couple of breakdowns myself. And when I say breakdowns, I don't mean psychotic breakdowns, but more breakdowns of meaning where I didn't know what the hell my life was about, where I was going, what I was doing, and who I was basically. And so then I got into therapy, and then eventually my therapist invited me on a training course. And there was a woman on that course I'd fancied, and I was just finishing I was just coming out of my marriage, my first marriage, and so I thought I'll sign up on that course just to get near that woman. So I did. It took me a while to get near her, but I did, and I first passed the first couple of years in a blur. And then I suddenly had the right teacher, and then suddenly something clicked with me, and I began to see a whole lot of things about how the psyche worked for the first time. And so I was kind of progressing quite quickly, and I was invited to assist somebody on a men's group program. And at that time we were a lot of people I knew in that world were ingesting the brilliant work of Robert Bly and others that we was doing with masculinity. Yeah, that's not a good book, but his work was fantastic. I mean, you know, compared to sitting with him, being with him.
Yeah.
But so we did this men's program called Brothers, and what happened to me, I realized on the program, although I was a rubbish assistant, but I realized there was sort of a group of men who were sort of dealing with something just a bit different, and they kind of recognized themselves, and had a kind of wounded quality to them. And in the end, I realized, well, these are all exporters, and I was an exporter myself, and I'd even been a teacher in a boarding school for a couple of years. And so I began to look into this phenomenon, and I wrote my qualifying thesis on this issue. And I developed then some workshops, which we started. The first one ran in 1990, and I called it Boarding School Survivors to be provocative. You know, the fact that you've got this elite privileged education, and like it is a social privilege, you know, the resources these schools have got, and the class sizes, you know, and the time to keep kids focused, you know, it's incredible social privilege. But what I was saying with the word survivors is that actually what happens to the children, who are a sort of forgotten element in this process between the schools and the parents buying into a sort of consumerist model of the best so-called education money can buy, is the child gets forgotten, and the child gets left out, and the child inside the boarding school survivor gets stranded and doesn't grow up properly, and loses his mom and dad, and loses home, and never comes home really. So that's why I call them survivors. And I wanted to say, look, it may be a privilege, but it's a terrific cost to this. And it's a cost on both an individual level and on a national level, because these people are going into leadership posts everywhere. And we've got a sort of a system of leadership, which is based on a disowning of vulnerability, disowning of feelings. And if people who've disowned their feelings and disowned vulnerability are in leadership position. How can they ever understand the vulnerable in societies? It's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So that's why I was saying, and I was saying it rather tentatively in the 90s when I was sort of coming out with this thesis. And I was terribly lucky just in the early 90s is that I got offered someone who's, well, I should go back a bit, because at boarding school, I was a sort of, I suppose I was a kind of a mild rebel in that I didn't believe it. And it was quite lucky for me because the first boarding school I went to was an American school in Europe, which was full of service personnel. This was the late 50s. Yeah. So I was in an American school. It was quite a benign school. And of course, I did all my separation there. And then I came from there to English public schools. And it's just, it was wow, you know. Suddenly I was a stupid child. I knew nothing. And, you know, and then there was all these rules and you couldn't walk over this bit of grass until you'd been there for like a year, or then you could walk over another bit of grass, and you were always getting into trouble. And then you were going to get beaten if you broke any of these rules. Now, an American school didn't have any of this, didn't have any beating. It didn't have a thing called games. We just hung about and threw a football to each other and stuff like this. And so I was really quite shocked. So I never kind of really got it. So I went through my boarding school career myself, actually quite bewildered about what's going on. And then I got to Oxford and I changed my course in Oxford, and I read Oriental languages and I studied the East. I wanted something out of that sort of hyper-rational paradigm I now know. And I got to India by getting a job in a school, a boarding school. And I got to India and I thought, why the hell everybody's so nice to me? You know, what's going on? I was aware of the history. And then that question took me on. So about the same time as I was developing this boarding school survival stuff, I started to realize the answer to that question, why the Indians were so nice, is we kind of defeated them on the inside. Because there's only a handful of men around that British Empire, and we must have we made them sort of stupid children who knew nothing. You know, and this to a culture that invented mathematics, invented, you know, had a notion of the oneness that we're still marveling at today. You know, it's quite extraordinary. So how we managed to do that. So it took me quite a long time to sort of put it all together. And then I could see that the whole boarding school culture was the entry to being put into a sort of a trance, to be sort of a hyper-rational servant of empire, which was going on and still going on, and has, you know, had a renaissance now. I mean, look at our leadership now, for God's sake. You know, completely out of touch, old Etonians running the show. And that in this background, children were suffering. They were having to do lots of disowning and dissociation, and they were being neglected. And what I began to realize over the years more and more, that when you've got neglect like this that's normalized, you're going to get abuse coming up inevitably. So the boarding system itself is a trauma, it's abusive to children because it takes away their attachments to mommy and daddy, and the whole growing up process gets completely skewed, and that happens to both boys and girls. So, and of course, a lot of people can go through this thing and says, well, it didn't do me any harm. But you have to realize that some of the personality and character formation will then be one which is rather independent and unemotional. And actually, you know, our emotions, our sexuality, our dependence on each other is a fundamental thing of human beings. And you know, you cannot get through this thing unscathed.
Yeah, I remember listening to you talk 2019 at the boarding school conference in London, and you saying at the beginning when you released the book, people were saying, is everyone negatively affected?
Yeah.
And you said, my understanding was, no, but you have to survive.
Yeah. It's not that everyone's damaged. That's what the press wanted to know, because in the early days, I had this amazing amount of press attention.
Right.
And I realized I'd hit on a kind of raw nerve. And it started when I got offered to do this article in the Independent from the woman actually whose roof I'd fixed, because when I came back from India, I was so kind of blown away by everything that I sort of dropped out of everything, and I wanted to do something with my hands and something real. And so I trained to be a carpenter, and I did all kinds of jobs. I worked as a slater's mate and a plasterer's mate and stuff like this, and tried to hide my posh voice and be accepted by kind of ordinary guys. And I still do carpentry work and stuff like that for myself. I still enjoy working with my hands. Anyway, I worked on a roof of this woman who very kindly let me sleep in her daughter's room while I was doing it, and she was incredibly nice to me. And she was a leading journalist, Angela Lambert, who's now dead, unfortunately. She wrote a very good book about the girls' boarding experiences. Any women listening to this, Angela Lambert's book, No Talking After Lights, it's a novel, but she puts all the claustrophobia of the girl's experience into this book. I highly recommend it. It's Penguin. You can probably get it for about 10p on one of these secondhand sites. And anyway, so she invited me to a housewarming party, and I turned up with this leaflet, Boarding School Survivors Workshops. This is like summer 1990. First one was due to run in September. She looked and she said, "Oh my God, I've been looking for someone to do an anti-column in the Independent."
Right.
Running, and I couldn't get anyone to speak against boarding school. Would you like the job? And I said yes. And so she gave me 1,000 words to write, and it paid 1,000 quid. I talked to journalists now, and they said, you don't even get half that these days. So I got paid for doing this thing. I read it on a pad of paper, sitting on a cliff in St. David's, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in the end of Wales. And this got published in the newspaper. I couldn't believe my luck. And then I had this huge mailbag of letters, because it was before email, and they kept sending it to me, and I was overwhelmed with letters. And a lot of the letters, people were saying, "Thank God someone has spoken out about this. I thought I was the only one."
Thank you. Yeah, for me, as I shared, I found your book transformational. So thank you for having the courage. And the last few years, I've been writing my own journey of boarding school, and I've had so much resistance to putting it out there. It's like, no, I don't want to do it. So you having the courage to do this 30 years ago, I'm just amazed. So thank you.
Well, it was scary for me too, Piers, because one of the things is that when I talk about you asked me about the picture and me as a child and what it does to the child. And I hinted just earlier, there's a way the child, because you're not growing up organically, you're growing up in an institution, you become institutionalized. And the values of the school are be independent, be self-sufficient, be an adult, don't be a child. So your child, in a way, becomes a pseudo-adult very fast. But that also means that the child is left behind in the psyche quite young. And I think you can see it in a lot of ex-boarders in their faces, certainly in the politicians, I noticed that. And so partly the thing is that if you start proselytizing about the boarding school experience, There's the bigger group is those who say it didn't do me any harm and it was the finest education in the world and it's character building. And when you say, actually, it's harmful, it breaks attachments, it damages children, you can meet a lot of hostility. And the way the hostility comes, it comes back to the child because these people know, perhaps not consciously, but they know there's a child in you, so that you get this inference that you're just a wet, you haven't grown up yet, Piers, you never left school. I mean, for God's sake, what are you? XYZ years old, you should have grown up by now and got on with it. And there are many, and even from the left wing, you'll get this way. There are many worse problems in life than whinging about the problems of the elite. Yeah. So just grow up and basically sod off. And it can be very hurtful.
Have you had much of that?
Well, I had some of that. And I had a voice in me that was doing it too, you see. I had to recognize a voice in me saying that, because one of the things is going through the system, a lot of us do a part, sort of bit of a Stockholm syndrome. So we part of our psyche is identified with the one that says, grow up, don't be vulnerable, be a big boy, be a winner, all this kind of stuff. Don't be a sissy, all that sort of, all that voice. What in the making of I described that as sort of internalized parent voice. Speaks to you and it speaks quite critically to the more vulnerable side of you.
Yeah, I do. I've not had many, but I have had the odd dissenter saying that with my videos online, saying, there's something wrong with me. A question I had, which just came up from reading your book and listening to your interview with Bryn a couple of days ago again on Western Australia, Real, is that idea that we have the survival personality of the conformist, the rebel, and the crushed, which I really love. And as you were sharing, you were saying you were a rebel. And then I was thinking, well, I was at school, I was a conformist, totally. I was in, first 15, good at sports. But now, my wife's like, no, you're definitely a rebel, Piers. And I'm like, am I? And I'm like, oh, yeah. And I was wondering, do we need to become a rebel almost in order to start breaking that survival personality?
Well, let's look at this. Let's unpack it a little bit, because that's a complex question. Okay. So what I've noticed with ex-boarders, and I start this on myself because I wrote the book that I needed to read and invented the course that I needed to go on. So it's partly internal and it's partly sort of my clinical experience, because I've been doing this for years now. So what I was going for is that as you said in the earlier question, it's not so much that everyone is damaged, it's that every child has to survive being alone in an institution without its parents. This is, and in its institution, and it's a kind of, especially for the young ones who sent away early, there is no school of child development in the world which encourages and supports this. It's not recommended. So you have to survive that. Now, how do you survive it? Well, I said, I think you actually construct a kind of personality based on elements that are already there in you, that you may have, you may have tried it out in the family or something, or you may have just come up with things. And I call that the strategic survival personality, because it's strategic because it's designed to keep you out of trouble, because in boarding school, it's so easy to get into trouble. So many rules, so few staff, so that the whole thing, it's the whole experience is like, how do you stay out of trouble? You stay out of trouble with the teachers, with the rules, with your peers, with the elder kids, So I call it a strategic survival personality, and it's formed by the child, and it starts getting formed often day one. And when I looked at this, saw, and I started to read around a bit, I saw that certain people, like various comedians, would tell stories about how, I think Tim Taylor used to tell the story that how he told a joke, and suddenly the whole atmosphere eased and everybody smiled at him, and he thought, oh, that's a good thing. Let's be, I'll be a comic. Yeah. And so he starts that, survival personality. Other people become remote or aloof, or some people become a sports hero or stuff like that. But it's in order to survive. Yeah. Or the most common one is to keep your head down and comply. And to be honest with you, it makes sense. So, and then you start to look at this in another way. I started breaking down into 3 rough categories. One I call the compliers, people who go along with it or keep their head down. And I'm not saying these people are bad, or it makes a lot of sense to do that. And then there are rebels. And the good news about the rebels is in a way they keep some level of outrage going. Yeah. But rebels are quite problematic because they often throw away their authority. So they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there's like I was, there are a lot of ex-border carpenters out there. Yeah.
I've been a plasterer's assistant, so yes.
And then there are people who actually get crushed by it. And I knew this because there was a boy in my school, my public school, who killed himself. He killed himself because he was a beautiful boy, and he attracted the attention from others in puberty, when we were all kind of wired up with testosterone, and the beautiful boys would be called tarts. It's terrible sort of system. So, and there's other people who get so teased or bullied or abused they really can't function. Now, you can, any sort of, that's a typology, and any typology in psychology is not the moon. It's the finger pointing at the moon. It's broad brush. So you can have a combination of all, of any of those types, Piers. So you can, I mean, you're obviously a bit of a rebel. Otherwise you wouldn't be sporting that outrageous beard. or unless a dog has landed on your face, I don't know. But,
thank you.
But you're obviously a rebel because you're doing this valuable work. You see, you're trying to help people express some of the things that they can't express everywhere else, and you do your podcast. But you can also be a bit of a complier, or you could have had a survival personality to sort of as a sports success, or head of house and all that sort of stuff. And good for you if you can do it. But one of the things that we do when we do our inquiry about these things, we said, like, when I took on that survival personality, and it may be just one, and it may be multiple, actually, yeah. What's the cost to me? What did I betray in myself? Is there a self-betrayal? And that's a sort of much more deeper question we have to look at. So when I decided to be a clown or a comic, what did I betray? So those questions go very deep, and they're sort of psychospiritual questions, actually, because for example, you could come out as a clown, like someone like a Jeremy Clarkson, a sort of a rather bullish clown. What does he betray? I don't know. That's a question for him. But I could imagine that someone who's a clown is betraying that actually he might care very deeply about things. And if you stand up caring very deeply about things, it makes you terribly vulnerable. And you can't be vulnerable in a boarding school. It's not possible.
Wow. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I could go off on 1,000 tangents here. Let me go back to my questions that I sent through to you. So the first question I have is, how hard is it to believe even that boarding school harmed you? because usually the ex-boarders don't realize or accept what harm and trauma they suffered during boarding.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, we've been going around this question a bit. I mean, it's a terribly important question. And how hard is it to believe even that boarding school harmed you? Well, I mean, I think the first thing for someone asking that question is to identify the different voices inside his or her head. You know, is there a voice that says, come on, grow up, you know, don't be a wuss, you know, and how strong is that voice, and where did they learn that voice? Yeah. And I think in terms of the strategic survival personality, your questioner is right when he or she says usually the exporters. I mean, we say the biggest group is the complier group. That's the biggest group, and they don't realize or accept. I mean, yeah, what harm or trauma they suffered during boarding. I mean, this is such a packed question, because when we work with ex-boarders and when we train therapists to work with ex-boarders, what we're saying is that you have to have a kind of overall model for doing this, and we call it the RAC model. And it goes that the first step is the recognition. That's the realization, the recognition that actually you were sent away from your home, and probably you couldn't understand it as a child, and it was just accident of birth or timing, and you'd grown up like every child on this planet to kind of expect that you would have ongoing care and support from your parents, because we are mammals. We're different from all other mammals in that we mature very, very slowly, and that is because of our big brains. That means that we're born actually rather prematurely. Otherwise, our mothers would have to have these much bigger hips to give birth to us, and the fashion industry would never have been what it is. And God's sake, we need the fashion industry. And so we're born to expect quite a long period of being in a family group before we go out and make our own way in the world. And the boarding habit goes against that, takes us out early into something which they call a community, but it isn't a community, because a community is all ages. This is institutionalization. So we have to realize that, and then and that's a process, and it doesn't happen to everybody at the same time. Some people bowl along fine on their life. Maybe they feel something's missing or something, or they don't feel anything. And then suddenly, let's say they may have a child, and that child becomes 8, and they see, oh my God, I was 8 when I was sent away. Look how wee he is. Yeah. Jesus, what was that like? So that begins the recognition phase. Or for others, you see, you might lose your job because boarders were always on a timetable, and work and project is the norm. So suddenly you got nothing. Yeah. And then, oh my God, all these thoughts and feelings come up. Yeah. So that can spark off the recognition. But the next stage is acceptance. And in the acceptance, you have to realize sort of things we were talking earlier about, Piers, is that in order to survive, you created this survival personality, and it was probably there in place of your parents. So you probably bonded to it as if it were a parent, because there was no one to bond to. Yeah. And so you cleave to this survival personality, and you're probably still at the age of 40, 50, 60, 70, maybe, still acting on the sort of behest of this survival personality, long overdue, someone you invented when you were 8. Yeah. And that's had a cost in your life, and accepting that and grieving that, and the loss of your relationships, perhaps with your parents, with your siblings, all that sort of accepting that. So that's the acceptance phase. It's difficult soul work. So,
Just interrupt there. I can really resonate with that, because I remember as an 11-year-old, I went from 11 till 18, is I left home partly because I didn't get on with my father. He was an alcoholic ex-boarder, and I said I want to go to boarding school to get away from him. But after a few weeks, I realized that I needed to have this part to keep people away from me. And the part I used was my father, this angry, aggressive, and I realized it was that much better to beat myself up than have 20 people or 30 people in the dormitory have a go. And so, like you said, this acceptance, it was like, realizing that my father was in there.
That's right. And just for those who are listening, what Piers is talking about, this quite often in the acceptance stage, you realize that your survival personality may have had quite a masochistic element to it, So I noticed for me, for years, I slept in bad beds because I just refused to make the bed, I was kind of, perhaps I was waiting for a mummy to come and make it or something, or a wife or girlfriend, but a level of self-care that I wasn't doing to myself, and that's masochistic actually. And in the masochistic style is you seize defeat from the gates of victory on the one hand, but you also beat yourself up before anyone else does, as you're saying. So accepting that level of self-betrayal and what you've done for yourself in order to survive, this is a heart and head process. This is not just the head, this is heart. Yeah. So acceptance process involves a lot of very deep feelings. As you'll know.
What about C? What's the C of the RAC?
The C is the change, and the change is substituting more realistic behaviors for these survival ones. So, for example, the strategic survival personality is always saying the world is a hostile place, stay out of trouble, So, for example, some boarders will say, I hear, their wife shouts out their name and they go, what have I done? And so they go immediately into
heard that conversation a few times this week.
And so they approach already tense, already offensive. And actually, it could be that call is the call just for intimacy and sharing and just being together. And so over time, the one who's making that call and getting a defensive response from the strategic survival personality in the border does a lot of harm. And so you have to also accept that you may have done harm to others. And then once you've done that in sufficient acceptance, usually the change starts to happen by itself, rather than trying to bolt on different behaviors. That so the acceptance is the key, and then more realistic, treating your partner as if she's the one who loves you, rather than she's your bloody housemaster. Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I can resonate with so much of that. The recognition, the acceptance, and the change. Thank you. So the next question I have is around homesickness. So one of my listeners has asked, please kindly speak on homesickness in detail, because for me this experience was so extreme and dreadful. My hair turned grey at age of 13. I missed my familiar environment so intensely.
Wow. I mean, that really got to me, that story. Yeah. Well, the first thing is that we're now building a bit of a community in this work, whereas, I started all on my own with it. And now, thank God, we've got quite we're building a group of professionals who understand this, and we're building a group of survivors who get it. And so we're not so alone as we used to be. But one of the things that I've noticed coming up in that group is a lot of us, we don't really like this word homesickness. We know what it means, but the thing is, even in the word, being sick for home seems to imply that there's something sick about it, that you're wrong, that you shouldn't be. But actually, missing your home and your mummy and your daddy and your pets and your brother and your sister and your local village or street or whatever it is, because you were attached to it, and those attachments are now broken, and you're not allowed to express the emotion that goes with that breaking, is something that goes against your fundamental rights as a human being. So to say, call that a sickness, it's a bit mixed up, because the sick part really is to put a prohibition on that. The sick part is to imagine that children are going to do better in an institution than they are at home until, and please take this seriously, until they are a decent age in which to have formed a safe enough attached self, with which the great pioneer John Bowlby of attachment therapy, who incidentally said I wouldn't send a dog to boarding school at the age of 8, one of his little known sayings, but he said it, and he was a boarder, and it's no wonder he formed attachment therapy in Britain, because we're the country who least understands attachments. No wonder it happened in Britain. And you see, once that having a good attachments means you become a resilient person, and the new work on resilience is showing that. And it doesn't mean that breaking attachments means that you become more resilient or toughened up. It doesn't work like that, actually. So the breaking of attachments in a deliberate process is quite hostile and can be fatal, actually. And we've seen this in the reports on the Canadian residential schools, where boarding schools were used for socializing the Plains Indians who had been sort of shoved up north from the US, and were in Canada anyway at the end of the 19th century, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they invented these boarding schools to turn them out and to be good working Christian citizens. And a lot of the children just died. They just gave up the ghost, and because it's a kind of a murder of the soul to say to a child, you shouldn't miss your mommy and daddy. So, and you can see it on the film, the making of them, where there's a woman teacher saying, yeah, it's normal to miss you, but we find that you'll find as you're here longer and longer, and you get busier and busier and busier, you'll stop missing it. So, you substitute that kind of doing activity for the being activity of feeling and being attached. It's a whole metaphysical thing that's going on there. So trying to turn us into little doing, little soldiers, when actually we're children, and our natural language is emotions, sexuality, spontaneity. So I sometimes call the whole thing the war against the inner indigenous. Yeah. And so homesickness doesn't quite do it for me as a word, because this is a very, very big issue. Anyway,
Mm,
it's
thank
an
you.
incredible story how the body can react with that grades. I'm very touched by that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't, yes, incredible. Um, thank you. So next question I have is about this guy. I went to a rural boarding school, age 11 to 18, extremely isolated and traumatic experience where survival strategy meant I couldn't develop socially or emotionally, and which left me utterly unprepared for real life. Feel like the pause button in my life was pressed for 7 years, just so I could survive the experience. Many ways I still feel like that 11-year-old, completely lost and adrift. The loss of family, childhood, and self is so huge, it has shaped everything about me. How can we ever fix ourselves when we have missed out on such key developmental foundations? When we have neglected and lost ourselves so completely? One thing I realize is that we really did miss out on key things we needed, and also that we don't realize what we should have or be because we never had it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so I think the major things to see what are the losses,
Mm.
and to grieve the losses. And I would say that for most of us, the loss is either in relationships or in the quality of relationships, and in the sense of home. And of course, you cannot change the story. You cannot change the story. And you can grieve the story, and it's worth grieving. And I think I think what's implicit in this question is how do we get out of being victim to something, or being deprived of these things? And I think one of the things you can do, and it certainly feels to me terribly important, is that you then you build relationships, and you treat them as absolute gold. That means your intimate relationships, your family relationships, your friendship relationships, that you value them tremendously. So, for example, you may grow up thinking, well, I was an abandoned child, then why should I bring more children into the world? They only get abandoned again. And I think it's better, let's say, if you didn't have a father or a mother, let's say one of the things you can do is become a father. And I'm saying, because I'm a man, from my own perspective, or become a mother, obviously. And in being a father, you feel what fathering is like. You feel what you might need it from your own father. You can project into your child. I don't mean to say that you compensate or overcompensate. That can be a danger, but actually, you bring fathering alive as a. That's my bell. I may have a special delivery, but you bring.
To pause it.
You can pause that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So if you missed out on being fathered, one of the ways to do it is to become a father. Take it seriously. If you missed out in having a home, permanent home, make a home. You missed out on a loving relationship, get into one. If you're already in a relationship and you realize you're projecting, let's say, as we said earlier, your housemaster onto your wife, stop it. And realize you're lucky to have someone who loves you. there's, you know, and you can become.
I have this horrible image of my housemaster's face on my wife now. He had these big sideburns.
Yeah, you can become the person you want to be through, you know, and then of course there's whole stages to this thing, you know, the one of the sort of common work, psychological work on having an abandoned child is actually to pay more attention to the child in you. So what I did in my early days is I found photograph of myself about the time I went away, and I carried it around in my pocket here.
Beautiful.
It's very interesting, and this pocket is in the shirt is right by the heart. So I carried this kid around and looked at him now and again, and did things like saying, you know, you asked me about the image on the book. No, I'm not going to put my child on that book. No way.
Because I've been thinking of putting the photo of me.
This is where he belongs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're making me question whether to put the photo of me going to.
No, that was an actor. You know, we cut that out from Time Out and pasted it in. So, yeah, don't overexpose. Cherish. If you've got children, cherish them. Be careful of overcompensating. Yeah. So, I mean, I did it in the beginning when I brought up my kids. There was just no boundaries whatsoever. So I you know, someone told me, and I had to make an adjustment. But so
yeah, that's interesting because I mean, partly I was a celibate monastic in my 20s. So I didn't have children, and then I met my wife and she had an older son, so I didn't have children. But interestingly, part of the work I went into post my monastic work, and I've had a breakdown similar to you, was work with children.
Yeah.
And because I'd done that inner work, it was like that little boy could come out and play. And so yeah, I noticed that wanting to give space for my little boy. Right, what are we going to do? Okay, let's paper airplanes. Good stuff. Bottle rockets. so yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I guess that leads on to the question I have about intimate relationships. You know, throughout Joy's book, Christine's, your own books, this idea of intimate relationships, I see that that's one of the areas we struggle in the most. What, over the 30 years or so that you've been doing work with ex-boarders, what do you suggest for us to start to cultivate open, loving, happy relationships, especially intimate relationships? We seem to be okay. Some of us seem to be okay with our children, but our wives or our husbands?
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that intimate relationships are the most difficult thing we ever do. It's much more difficult than going to work. And that the dyadic one-to-one intimate relationship it's existentially a problem, because the human being is always like seeing their own movie. We're in this kind of narcissism all the time. So intimate relationships are always going to challenge our narcissism. So, and that's like everywhere for everybody. So that's one level. The next level is that there's gender difference in relationships. Despite the current trend for making everything equal or fluid, is that the being wired to produce another being in your body, whether you do it or not, gives a kind of a slightly different slant in the brain for the one-to-one experience. So it doesn't mean to say that women are better at it, but it's a more it's more on the agenda in some ways, whereas men have different ways of expressing love and affection and bonding, usually through a third thing. So one of the things we learned in those early days in the men's movement, if you want to reconnect to your father, who you've been distant from, you'll have much more success saying, let's go and watch a football game or go fishing, than to go charging in saying, I love you, or why weren't you there for me? That's too intense one-to-one. The men like a third thing to bounce through. In women like the one-to-one. Actually, I think men are less suited to individual therapy myself, and better off in group therapy, but it's just, I can't prove any of this. It's just, so now the next thing is, if you've been brought up in an institution, what kind of institution is it? Because institution means growing up in a group. It means you're never alone, you're private space. So you tend to internalize, become more private, so you can survive in that thing. Now, what kind of institution was it? Well, a boarding school was, you could say, hyper rational, hyper masculine, rather militaristic. So it's not a very feminine experience. And you could say the feminine nature of one-to-one intimate relationships is such that in order to make it work, you've got to be willing to open up, to become voluntarily vulnerable in an intimate relationship. And vulnerability is the thing you are never allowed to do.
Definitely not.
So sometimes I say, because I don't, oh my God, stop. Sorry, again. Yeah.
So voluntary vulnerable.
Yeah. To be successful in an intimate relationship, I reckon you have to accept that you're going to have to be voluntarily vulnerable. And in a boarding school, being vulnerable at any stage is a no-no. So you've taught your body over 5 or 10 years, your body's been instructed to retreat from vulnerable situations. So I sometimes say to people, when I see them in couple therapy, because that's the one, I don't do individual therapy anymore. I see some couples and I work in training groups, but I sometimes say to people, look, you had the worst training in the world for intimacy. See, that's part of recognition and acceptance. Yeah. And I say, you're going to have to relearn this. You're going to have to, you really going to teach yourself what it's like in a situation, because you've probably got a partner by now who's pretty fed up with you. Yeah. And let's again go from the more sort of classic male experience. And please, listeners, hear this gender stuff, in a broad brush way. I'm not arguing very specific points, but let's say from the classic male experience, if you've got a partner who you have been retreating from, or you've been defensive, or you've been angry. So those are 3 possibilities of not engaging really in relationship whilst you're not separated. Yeah. She's going to have a built up store of resentment about how happy she's been over the years. And in order to start fixing this thing, you've got to hear that. So whilst your psyche is still running on the strategic survival personality, you don't want to hear how you've done wrong. You will hear it as criticism. And in order to get any further, you've got to actually take in a lot more criticism. Yeah. So one of the things you have to learn is that what you hear as criticism is just the person you're with telling you, sharing with you that she's unhappy. So on one hand, it sounds like criticism. On the other hand, it's just an emotional communication. And if you haven't been doing that, it will have stored up and got worse over the years. So the first thing to do is you've got to learn to be present.
My wife teaches that all the time. Men, they need to be present.
Just be there. You don't have to be perfect. Just be there. Listen, hear it, breathe deeply.
Yeah, breathing.
Yeah, when I'm starting this, I had to visualize that I had a big, because I told you I was a carpenter. I had this big stainless steel bolt inside of me when I realized I had to stay because everything in me wanted to run. No, I got to answer the doorbell or whatever. I got to do something more important. Blah, 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 blah. Check the emails. Read the newspaper. Yeah. I just visualize this bolt and I just nice ratchet. Good action ratchet. Tighten up. Stay. Learn to stay. Teach the body you can survive it. You're not actually going to have a panic attack. It's going to be a bit uncomfortable in the beginning, and you start getting better at it. And then you start being actually more present. So you can actually hear what it's like for the other. And not immediately come back and say, well, you're a controlling old what's it anyway, which is, some of us have a natural, I have natural tendency to do that, but so some things you have to inhibit in this learning process.
Thank you. That's really helpful. It's kind of, really resonates with what I've learned over the years about the presence. Thank you. How are we doing time-wise? We've probably got another 15, 20 minutes or so. How are you getting on?
It's fine. Yeah, another 15 minutes is enough. Yeah.
Good. Another question I had was just around dissociation.
Yeah.
I notice, and there's quite a lot of literature, and you talk about it in your in this book about dissociation.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's something you can share with us just about what we can do to stop this splitting, like when we are in that moment with our partners and we start to dissociate.
Yeah.
We're not there anymore. So, yeah.
Well, you see, dissociation, the reason I didn't write so much about it in the making of them, because I hadn't spotted it quite so well in myself until then. Because the whole thing about dissociation is that it's an unconscious process, and parts of yourselves go unconscious, and we learn it. I mean, I tell you, it's a basic function. All human minds can do it. It's terribly useful in many situations, because if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're going through the jungle and you hear the roar of a tiger, up in the tree or something like that, this is not the time to go through your emotional responses. It's trying to think, how the hell do I get out of this situation? And so there's the time and place for emotions. But of course, when we've been brought up in a hostile environment, we learn to dissociate as a survival response, but we also learn to, if I look back to being in school, I spent hours looking out the window in class, hours and hours, just being somewhere else. And I started to realize I could still do that. When my partner was talking to me, I would be sort of planning some sort of carpentry details or something. So that's dissociation. Just thinking of something else is the first way of doing it. But the breakthrough for me in my life came when I started to realize how much anxiety I was sitting on, and how that was actually feeding into all the survival processes. And so the recognition of anxiety and feeling it coming up and saying, oh, this is anxiety, or hello, anxiety. So I developed you could say, I developed a sort of triadic position. Instead of there's the one who's supposed to be listening to someone and the one who's thinking of something else, or in brackets, feeling very anxious about it, I also developed the one who has spotted this anxiety. And naming the anxiety then gets me present, because I don't know, oh, it's just simply anxiety. It's anxiety because I spent many years in an institution where it wasn't safe. And that's, for me, was the most helpful thing. You know, it's not surprising that we've been running on a lot of anxiety when we've had such formative experiences. And after a bit, you take it, you know, you take it as normal because you don't know how anyone else feels. And the people now working in this sort of the neuroscience and trauma and are sort of now getting quite good at describing what the physiology of these things are. It means we tend to run a lot more cortisol and adrenaline than we should be doing, and we tend to store our traumatic experiences in the wrong part of the memory, so we're always recapitulating the idea that the world is a hostile place, and it leads to what they call hypervigilance, always kind of scanning for safety. And you know, human beings are wired to scan for safety. We'll always do that, but we don't need to do it so much. And if we overdo it, we start to lose confidence and ability to read facial signals, things like that. So we kind of get trapped more and more in our own world. So I think getting to understand and recognize your anxiety is absolutely key to stop dissociating. And because dissociating is it's kind of on-off process. And you over time, you can stop the reflex of switching off and staying present.
Thank you, Nick. So, one of the things I'd kind of like to kind of finish on is just this idea of, and I've not put it in as one of the questions, but what can we do moving forward with the current situation, with boarding school? How do we bring healing? I know that it's beginning and there's wonderful work that you're doing, but like you said, there's these institutions which are still very powerful. I get asked this question often in my podcast, so I'd just love for you to maybe unpack that.
Yeah, well, you see, that's I go back to what I said right in the beginning. Is the boarding school thing is both personal, psychological, it's educational, it's sociological, and it's political. And in terms of making any changes in our society, part of the work that I've been doing over the years is to try to raise consciousness, so attention to this, to hope that parents of prospective boarders get to hear about it and decide to take another route. Over the years, I've had various meetings with various politicians about it, and we've been holding various conferences around the world to sort of also bring attention. So, and for example, the whole notion of elite education and socialization. Some people are studying that. So I'm off to Switzerland next month to give a lecture to the University of St. Gallen about bringing up elites. So it's beginning to happen, and it's also the other thing that's interesting. It's beginning to happen in the social sciences. There's beginning they're beginning to get more joined up, so that it's not completely mad that a psychotherapist would be invited to speak to sociologists, whereas 20 years ago it never happened. So but it's a slow process. And when it comes to the British scene, it is quite political. So I don't know whether it's a question of more activism. I don't quite know how we do that. There are, for example, in December, there's a study day run by an organization called Opus, on which I'm speaking, which is an organization which looks at the structure of organizations in Britain. And there's an online study day. So you can find that on my website, boardingschoolsurvivors.co.uk, for therapists page, and
put a link in the bottom of the description as well.
Yeah, and and on the Opus website. So there are things like that where you can mobilize, and maybe those are the kind of questions we need to be asking a bit more with a bit more courage now. How can we actually stop future children suffering from this, and how can we ensure that we have more rounded leaders? And I welcome people's suggestions for this. It's got to be work that's carried on, because quite frankly, our European neighbors, and they don't want to do this. They're not interested in this kind of education. It's a very Anglophone thing. So it's British and British colonies, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and the US, really, who go in for this in a big way. And now we're exporting it, with the boarding schools are expanding. They've got sort of franchises in Singapore and places like that. So it grows. And educationally, I would say to parents, keep your kids at home, get involved with the local PTA and things like that, because we need the articulate parents in the state system. Yeah. Because the problem in Britain is the state system is seen in certain quarters as a sort of ugly sister, of the private education, or what's improperly called the independent system. And I think that's really bad. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how we do the next pieces, but they need to be done.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to open that conversation, and if I can support you in any way. Yeah. I was speaking to someone in my podcast a few weeks ago who was also at Christ Hospital, and we were talking about approaching the school and actually going, right, we need to bring mental health, emotional health in, and whether we start going into school separately. Again, I don't know, but I just feel it's got this huge impact.
Well, one of the things that needs to happen politically is that the charitable status of the public schools needs to be challenged. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that will affect the status of other things like Montessori and Steiner at the same time. So even the alternative educationalists are against that. So it's complex.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's watch this space, and if I can support you with your work in any way, just let me know. So we're coming to the end. I'd love to, if you'd like to say a few words to complete, and also how people get in touch with you?
I've said plenty, but if you're interested in what we offer, which is mostly workshops and reading material, and sometimes referral to therapists who understand this work, because it's really hard to do it on your own. Go to www.boardingschoolsurvivors.co.uk.
Yeah.
And you'll find our website. There's also another website called Wounded Leaders, and which is more of the psychohistory, and just also people just be a little cautious about too much proselytizing out there on their own, because you can get awfully hurt if it lands in the wrong place, and you get the return attack. And so, and another thing, let me just say just a couple of words of warning: if you want to have that big conversation with your parents, be careful, because they may just feel that you're being guilt tripped or something. So it may be a bit disappointing. And if you want to go back to your old school to visit it, take someone who loves you and cares about you with you. Don't do it on your own.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That's a really good point. And thank you. I've heard people trying to ask their boarding schools to apologize, and that's also not turned out very well either.
No.
Well, thank you so much. I just really honor you for your courage in doing this work. I think it's amazing. And thank you for the work, your books. And I do recommend, reading, if you've been to boarding school, reading both books, Trauma Abandonment, Privilege, that's brilliant, and The Making of Them.
Where's Wounded Leaders? That's the other one. That's my favorite. Have you got
is
that?
It? I haven't got that one, to be honest. I need to get that one. I'd like to get your relationships, because you've done 5 now, haven't you?
Yeah. So Wounded Leaders is my favorite because I tried to write it as if I was doing a sort of Breaking Bad scenario. So I like that. But that's the political one. That's when I really let it all loose. So anyway, thank you terribly much for giving me the platform and for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. Nice. Okay.
Pleasure. Thank you, Nick.
Okay.